Okay, welcome back. Welcome back. Hopefully, you enjoyed the coffee break both here and over there. And we will now continue the program with the other important field of FFF's expertise, sensory studies and individual food experience. Because, as we know, personal food preferences and sensory quality of food, it is an important, if not the most important, driver of the actual food choice, also in the case of healthy foods. And we will now start this session with a presentation of Dr. Sophie Niklaus. She's a research director at the Center for Food Taste and Feeding Behavior in Dijon, France. Sophie is highly acknowledged and awarded researcher and the leader of the team Determinants of Eating Behavior across the lifespan, relationships with health. Her research aims to encourage a healthy and sustainable diet by associating healthy eating with pleasure from the very first years of life. And we will now hear her recorded presentation on the shaping of food preferences by taste experience in infants and children. And also Sophie is present online and available for discussion after this presentation. So Sophie, please.
Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to be with you today, although not in person, but virtually. I want to thank Marie Akala, Marie Sandel for an invitation to join this very special anniversary of the Functional Foods Forum. Very happy to be with you. And today I will be speaking about my research on the shaping of food preferences by taste experience in infants and children. I will try to summarize something like 20 years of research in 20 minutes. So I hope it won't be too busy. So after a short introduction, I will be talking about the evolution of taste preference early in life, then talking about the effect of taste on food preferences and intake. And then I will be mentioning the effect of early taste experience on food preferences in children. So first, let's start by the very beginning, the first 1,000 days. So you may have heard of this period as an important period for metabolic programming. During this time window, from conception to the second birthday, the child in development is very sensitive to the quality of the environment. And in fact, there is imprinting during this period in such a way that the quality of the nutritional environment is likely to impact the development of the organs. In this context, the purpose of my research is to understand the programming of food preference during this period. So let's have a look at the evolution in the mode of feeding during this period. It evolves from tube feeding, cord feeding during pregnancy to milk feeding after birth, complementary feeding by the midterm of the first year, until the child moves to family food by the end of the second year, or even before. At that time, there is a development of food neophobia, that is the fear of new food that is experienced by a vast majority of children in a given population. So as you can see, there are very important transitions in the mode of feeding during this very short period of time. At the end of this period, we've studied tracking, or we followed a cohort from the age of 2 to 3 years until early adulthood. And we showed that eating behavior at the age of 2 to 3 years predicts eating behavior to early adulthood. So there is a clear indication that eating behavior, and in particular food preferences, are partly set already at a very early age. In this context, for us, it's very important to understand how children learn to eat during this very early period of life. So we are particularly interested in the role of early feeding experience in shaping food preferences in children. What was previously shown by some colleagues was the effect of repeated exposure on complementary feeding acceptance, showing that even a disliked vegetable like in this case, green beans, can end up being liked after repeated exposure. And in fact, in that study, we showed that after 8 repeated exposure to green bean became as liked and as consumed as carrot were. So this led to the notion that children are able to learn to eat food. And that was extended further by other research that we conducted with colleagues in the frame of EU-funded project named ABEAT, where we looked at learning process across a vast number of children between the age of 6 months and 36 months. What we found was that some children were learners. They had the ability to learn to like a new food. Some were non-eaters, so whatever, it didn't matter how many times you wanted them to eat a given food, they wouldn't learn to like it. And some were plate clearers, meaning that they would eat the entire plate from the very beginning of the experience. Then we had other learning patterns. So in this, it's very interesting to try to understand what is going on and what are the mechanisms that are driving to these different learning patterns in children. And to understand this variability, we're looking in particular at the role of senses in these learning processes. So our senses are a gateway to the world, and taste in particular is the only sense that is exclusively devoted to guiding food choices. So, of course, you are well aware of the sense of taste, and you know that it can signal for the taste of sweet food, sour food, bitter food, salty food, and umami food. And also, it's related to the taste sensation, so it can be considered as textural sensation, but also a taste one. So in this context, we're interested in understanding the contribution of taste perception and taste preferences to food preferences in children and how this develops early in life. So to study the evolution of taste preference early in life, first we wanted to know how the different taste perceptions were liked at birth, collapsing a variety of previous studies. We showed that the sweet taste is associated to expressions of pleasure, and in general, the sweeter a solution, the more it is consumed. Bitter taste, on the contrary, is associated to expression of disgusts, and bitter solutions are generally not consumed. Salty taste is associated to expressions of indifference or aversion, and it's little consumed. Contrarily, umami taste is associated to expression of pleasure, and it's well consumed. Whereas sour taste is associated to expressions of disgust, but still it can be a little bit consumed, contrarily to bitter taste. And when we started to do this work, there were very few or inconsistent observations about taste preferences for fat in children. So to measure taste preference, we undertook this effort in a large program within a birth cohort named OPALIN. It's the Observatory of Food Preferences in Infants of Children. This cohort was set up in Dijon, where we work, and we conducted a longitudinal evaluation of many aspects related to feeding, and in particular, related to taste preference at the age of 3, 6, 12, and 20 months of age. All basic tastes were evaluated with all infants, and fat taste was evaluated with only a subpart of the cohort. To evaluate liking or preference for each taste, we used a 4-bottle paradigm where 4 bottles were presented to the child during 45 seconds. First, a bottle of water was presented, then a bottle of a taste and solution, another one of the same taste and solution, and then another bottle of water. We measured how much the child drank of each bottle, and we calculate a ratio that's expressed as the sum of the volume ingested for the 2 bottles of the tastant over the 4 bottles the child was presented to. So that's a relative measure of consumption of the salty taste, for instance, relative to water. So doing so, we were able to show the evolution of taste preferences in infants across the ages we studied. We showed in particular that at the age of 3 months, sweetness is preferred over water. At 6 months, sweetness, saltiness, and umami taste are preferred over water. At 12 months, saltiness and sweetness are preferred over water, and the fat emulsion is rejected over water. And this was quite interesting because, as I said, there were very few previous observations, and there was also the idea that fat taste preference was innate or inborn, which doesn't seem to be the case for us, at least at the age of 12 months, but even before. And then at 20 months, all tastes except sweetness were rejected over water. So we showed in particular a very sharp evolution in acceptance of the salty taste over age. Okay, then I will skip that part. We were interested in particular at understanding the effect of individual characteristics or the association between individual characteristics and this ingestion ratio. We found a lower acceptance of saltiness and umami tastes in girls than in boys at the age of 20 months, and also a higher acceptance of fat taste in infants born heavier or taller, but only at the age of 20 months. Then, coming to the next part of my presentation, we wondered about the effect of taste, the taste of a food, on food preference and intake in children. So in particular, still within our Opaline cohort, we looked at whether the variations in ingestion ratio for each of the primary tastes were related to acceptance of food bearing these tastes. And in fact, we found that variation in acceptance of the sweet taste predicts the acceptance of some sweet foods that we analyzed, not all of them. Variation in acceptance of umami taste was also predicting the acceptance of some umami food, and the same for sour food. So indeed, the more children like those tastes and the more they like the food with the same similar overall taste. Then we had a different analysis of our Opaline data, looking at acceptance of new foods between the age of 5 and 7 months. We looked at how much the infants accepted the food they were fed according to parental reports. So overall, we found that all foods were majorly accepted with an acceptance rate of 88%. But when we broke it down, according to the taste of the food the children were given, we found that acceptance of new food actually varied according to their tastes. And as you can see on this bar chart, salty vegetables were actually more liked than bitter and sweet and bitter vegetables. Which means that the salty taste is probably attractive for children at this age, which is not necessarily good news because for sure at this age, the renal function is still immature, and children have a hard time managing higher amounts of sodium. So we don't necessarily want to add a lot of salt in their food, but at least with this reporting of observations by parents help us to understand the role of salty taste in acceptance. Then we pursued to try to understand the contribution of taste on food consumption by looking at the addition of salt, fat, and sugar in a variety of foods on the amount that is eaten in a real lunch taken in a nursery. So we did that study with toddlers, and we indeed found that the more salt level was added to the more salt was added to the food, the higher the intake for green beans and as well for pasta. We didn't find the same observation for fat or for sugar. We extend this observation in school-aged children, and we indeed also found that the addition of salt was associated to a higher intake. And we also draw a more complex model for this age group, trying to understand the predictors of food intake and looking in particular at the level of liking for salt that was added in the food. And in fact, the predictors were in that order: the level of hunger of the child at the beginning of the meal, then the liking of the food. We still had two food groups here, green beans and pasta. And then the third predictor was liking of the salt level. So it was indeed a predictor of intake, but only third to hunger and liking of the food. Then we were wondering whether taste would modulate learning mechanisms in children. So coming back to the repeated exposure study that I initially showed, we refined a little bit the paradigm to explore how learning may be modulated by association with sweet taste or with fatty taste, which is also associated with an increase in energy density. So we fed children with an artichoke puree that was either basic, sweet, or fat. And we looked at how much this would impact the acceptance of the basic artichoke puree without sweetness or without fattiness before and after repeated exposure, 10 exposure to this modified version. What we found was, again, we showed a strong repeated exposure effect. But we found that the association with the sweet taste did not increase the intake of basic artichoke puree compared to the consumption of the basic puree. And that's the comparison between the white bar and the gray bar here. Contrarily, the association with a high energy density led to conditioned satiation in children who did not increase as much their consumption of the basic artichoke puree. And these effects were stable even 3 months after the end of the exposure to this food. We expanded this to the effect of salty taste, trying to see if the addition of salt would modify the learning for the taste of salsified puree. This time, oh, sorry, there's a mistake here. Children were aged 2 to 3 years, and we measured salsify intake. Sorry, it's a problem with the copy paste. We measured salsify intake after 10 exposure to either a version with that's basic, a version with salt, or with nutmeg. What we found, again, that merely repeating the presentation of a new vegetable promotes its acceptance, but we found no increase in acceptance with the association with salt, and no increase in acceptance with the association with the light spice that was nutmeg in these experiments on acceptance. So again, salty taste did not modulate the learning for this food in toddlers. Then we also wondered about the effect of taste experience, that is what children regularly eat, on driving their food preference, and in particular, food preference for foods bearing certain tastes. Coming back to our opaline cohort, we wondered about exposure to tastes in the milk context. So we know that breast milk contains more glutamate than formula milk, and it's 14 times higher. So it's really a very high difference in glutamate concentration. We know that breast milk is sweet, but glutamate may impart a slightly umami taste, and that's generally the taste that describes best glutamate. And we indeed found in our study that a longer breastfeeding association was associated to a higher preference for the umami taste at the age of 6 months. So we assume that the longer breastfeeding duration was associated to a longer exposure to glutamate, which indeed was associated to a higher acceptance of the umami taste at the beginning of complementary feeding, so around the age of 6 months. Then we used a different approach to consider the exposure to tastes in complementary foods. And we used sensory profile to describe the taste intensities of infant foods, really by undertaking a lot of profiles of a variety of infant foods that helped us to characterize the diets of children, because we asked their parents to report everything that they would feed to their children during the course of the first year, and we converted this dietary exposure to taste exposure by considering the frequency of service of these foods and their intensity, the taste intensities. So doing so, we could characterize the intensities of taste in the diet of this group of French children. And as you can see here on this graph, we can see that the sweet taste was the dominant taste in the taste of French children. Then the sour taste, salty taste, umami, and finally the bitter taste, not very surprisingly, but the one the children were the least exposed to. So really we've had this idea that the sweet taste was a dominant taste in children. We looked also what predicted exposure to sweet taste and also to fatty taste in a separate work. And we showed in particular that at the age of 10 to 12 months, there was a higher exposure to sweet taste and fatty taste in boys than in girls. And also, we found that sweetness exposure was higher if complementary food introduction started before the age of 6 months. It was also higher if children were exposed to more adult foods. For fatty taste, it was mostly the same. Then we tried to understand whether exposure to sweetness was associated to sweetness liking at the age of 6 months. And actually this work was presented by Karina Mueller at the British Feeding and Drinking Group that was held in mid-April. So these are fresh results. We found no association between exposure to sweet taste, either between 3 and 6 months or between 10 and 12 months, and sweetness liking either at 6 months, either at 12 months. And we found no association in another work that was undertaken by Camille Schwartz several years ago, no association between exposure to other primary tastes over the first year and preference for each specific taste at the age of 6 years. Okay, we followed those kids when they were older, at 7 to 10 years old, trying to understand how much they liked food using preference tests at the lab, whether they were motivated to work to get snacks, sweet snacks or salty snacks, and their sugar intake in a buffet. What we found was that there was no effect of very early exposure to sweet taste, that is between 10 and 12 months old, on sweet food choice, or liking, sorry, sweet food choice, sugar intake, but there was an effect on motivation to work for sweet versus non-sweet snacks. And there was no effect of their current exposure to sweet taste at the time we ran the study. So I'll skip this one, sorry. In another cohort, we also looked at dietary intakes in terms of carbohydrates and fat, and sweetness liking and fattiness liking. We found that none of the early dietary exposure variable was related to fattiness liking. Carbohydrate intake at 8 months was positively but weakly associated with sweetness and fattiness. And in girls only, not in boys, carbohydrate intake at the age of 12 months was positively associated with liking for sweetness. So a little indication of an effect of early exposure to sweet taste on sweetness liking, but in girls only. So I'm gonna wrap up this presentation by drawing a couple of conclusions. There are many. We found that sweet taste is liked in early childhood, but salty taste also becomes very much liked over the first year, and it appears also like a driver of intake later in childhood. There's a high variability in primary taste liking in babies, so they are not all alike in their taste preference. And actually, this may predict the acceptance of some sweet food, as we showed in particular in the case of sweet, umami, and sour tastes. But it's not fully bidirectional, meaning that for some of these foods, they are very much liked and doesn't depend on how much the child likes their individual taste characteristics. Exposure to sweet taste is dominant in the diet of French infants and increasing with age, but does not necessarily sweet taste liking. So maybe in our cohort, the exposure to sweetness is too homogeneous to really show a differential effect of this varied exposure. So we showed indicators of sweet tooth in children, but we also found that salty tooth compete with sweet tooth. and showed altogether very small effect of early or current exposure to sweet taste on sweetness liking. So altogether, what we can say is that taste preference are likely to influence food preference, and that's quite clear from our data. But the taste of food seemed to be a strong driver of short-term intake of a food, but their long-term role on conditioning learning to like a food was more difficult to show according to our results. So that's all for me for today. I want to thank my collaborators involved in this work, and in particular the doctoral students, Camille Schwartz, Wenlun Yuan, Camille Diver, Sophia Boulal worked on this data. Thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to share or to answer your question if we still have time for the Q&A session. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Thank you very much, Sophie, for your really, really interesting presentation on taste preferences of a newly born child and early childhood. Would it be okay that we now first hear Mari Sandel's presentation of the same session, and then we will have again a joint question, Q&A session after that. So if we first hear Mari's presentation. So hopefully you can stay online. Is it okay?
Yes. Yeah,
great,
no problem.
great.
Thank you.
Good. So now we hear Professor Mari Sandel's presentation from in the same session. Mari is alumnus of University of Turku and has been involved into work of Functional Foods Forum from the very, very beginning. And currently she is professor in sensory food science at University of Helsinki, as well as professor in sensory perception at University of Turku. And Mari's current research interests include individual differences in multisensory perception connected to eating behavior and experiences, as well as sensory-based food education, both for children and adults. And now we will hear Mari's presentation on individual differences in sensory perception. Mari, please.
Thank you, Anu, for your nice introduction. And hello, everyone, and thank you, Sophie, for such a great presentation. Let's take the comments after this one. So I decided to tell you the story of a Food Taste Finland project. And it actually started before we had FFF, so it was year 2000 and July when Professor Heikki Kallio asked me to think about what kind of sensory laboratory the new food research unit should and could have at the University of Turku. And for those of you who don't know that how the sensory laboratory looks like, I do have here some photos, the laboratory photos, and you can see those more like the white laboratories. Those are sensory laboratory of Functional Foods Forum. So the dream came true 2002. And then 2015, another dream came true when we got a completely new multisensory laboratory for 3-person. And then later on at 2019, we got the multisensory laboratory for 40 person and study participants. I selected now a few highlights from the past 20 years, which are describing the Food Taste Finland results. We have received funding from Academia of Finland, and we have received funding from the Business Finland, and there is various different kind of collaboration between different research groups and different universities, different countries in Europe and beyond. The Senses and Food team, it was established 2007. And it was a big moment at that time. I calculated that together we have published around 100 publications so far, and we have been very active in different conferences and also in media. So you can see the numbers here as well. Monel Chemical Sensor Center plays an important role in this story, and I have been there a few times, and I also met Sophie there 2005 and 2006. We were both working there at the same time, and during these years, for example, Sari Puputti from the Senses and Food team have been working there as well, and it truly has an important role in this story. Two members of the Senses and Food group decided to have their own dream, they decided to have their own company, and for the few years they have been working already in a company called Aistila, which also have a role in this nice story of Food Taste Finland. But I'm not able to tell you everything what has happened during the past 20 years, so I decided to focus on the individual differences in sensory perception, which have been one of the key and core activity of this research, mainly funded by the Academy of Finland, and the data has been collected and processed by the Senses and Food team, and there is a lot of different kind of variation. It all started 2007 when I got my first postdoctoral funding from the Academy of Finland, and that was more like the establishing the group and starting the activities, and it was focusing on quite a lot to test TUA38 taste receptor gene and its connection to food perception. But another level, the second level, focusing on the pido-taste perception and eating behavior, it included already a very different kind of activities and work packages, collaboration with Monel Chemical Sensor Center, different Finnish cohort activities, and also, for example, University of Vaasa, and then food chemistry unit. And taste contribution, food molecules have been pretty much in the key issue also in our story. But saliva plays an important role in tasting, and this collaboration with the University Hospital and also Institute of Dentistry, it has been a very, very nice trip, and it's still going on. I don't know what happened to my mic, but wish you are able to hear me. Like Anu mentioned, the sensory food education have an important role of this story as well, and we have been work both with children, kindergarten children and school-age children, and then adults as well. And with these blue lights, they are examples of the publications that we have published together during this project. The third level of this program, or the individual differences activities, was focusing on the human taste sensitivity and multisensory food perception, which included a work package where different kind of sensory study activities were conducted with Finnish adults. And in addition to those, we collected DNA samples focusing on the taste genes and oral microbiota samples. And then our subjects, or study participants, they filled very different kind of food-related questionnaires. Then part of this sample, or part of these people, they participated also the study sessions in the multisensory laboratory, and we really wanted to see that how the environmental factors around the eating and selection and food choice moment, how they are contributing to the event and choices. So far, from these activities, Sari Puputti defended her PhD just when the Corona and COVID-19 pandemic started, and it was actually the first remote PhD defense where I participated as a custos. And then Sulo Roukka is working at the moment with his PhD thesis at the University of Helsinki. Examples of the PhDs now. I'm not able to show you all the results, but I selected a couple of pretty interesting results. I told you that the people have been testing and trying and really evaluating a lot of different kind of taste samples and different taste modalities, and then also chemesthesis samples like cooling and pungency and astringency modalities. And based on the very wide and large data, we calculated sensitivity scores both for the taste and then for the chemesthesis, and these figures are explaining now and describing those scores. In case of the taste, our study shows that from Finnish adults, and this sample, around 30% of the participants belong to group of very, very sensitive person when all the taste modalities are taken into account at once. And then in case of the chemesthesis, the number is a little bit higher, 16% belong to this very sensitive group. And then, of course, the question was that what is actually explaining, what kind of factors are explaining these individual differences? Well, older people are less sensitive than younger people. And sorry to tell you about this news. Males are also less sensitive than females in general, but there were also individual differences. So age is predicting that, age was also predicting the taste modality recognition. And then the higher body mass index and the gender, in case of males, they were less sensitive in umami taste. It was maybe a little bit surprised that we didn't find any association in case of the smoking and taste sensitivity, but we also had a quite small number of those people who are smoking and reported to be smokers. Then how the taste sensitivity is associating to the food consumption. Well, better than it is actually associating the food consumption behavior, but not to the recalled pleasantness, which means that if I'm asking you that how much do you like, for example, strawberries, not without giving you the sample to taste, but asking your opinion. That's called the recalled pleasantness. And those people who are sensitive to bitter taste and had higher taste score, sensitivity score, they reported to consume less coffee and pungent foods. In case of the umami sensitivity, and sour taste sensitivity, there was a connection to higher salty and savory food consumption. And then the ketchup, which is very nice detail, and you may think about your own behavior at the moment. It may be, and it looks like based on our results, that it's related to how higher bitter, sweet and salty sensitivity. So these are now the examples of the results. But in addition to pure tasting and food consumption, we also studied the different kind of interactions between the senses. And this is now the example how the taste of sense of taste and then sense of sight are communicating. We asked people to rank different colored liquids. And when people said that red was the sweetest one, they also described it as strawberry and candy and those kind of properties. For some people, the red was also very sour, and in that case, they described it, for example, with the lingonberry or the cranberry. And yellow was something that 50% or 54% of the people said that it is sour, but there were also people who said that it was actually the sweetest sample of these color, the liquid colors. Then I told you about the multisensory lab, which we got 2015, and this study shows you that when we compare the control space, pretty much like where we are now, and then the environment where we had the forest landscape and bird songs, and then also the scents that had the orange quality, we noticed that people, while they were eating and while they were selecting the food, they reported to be more happy in the forest environment, more relaxed and invigorated in the forest environment compared to the control. I'm almost in the end, and I know that I need to stop soon, but I will still activate our memories and experiences with the selected visual stimuli. Those are photos from my phone, from my camera that I have took during the past 20 years. And I'm sorry if I'm not contributing and giving you emotional effects as well, but I want to share these memories with you. And and I start with eating together. So we have done a lot of eating together because, of course, we are food units and food is very important for us. And of course, it's always dealing with the sensory benchmarking. We have offered for several times our sensory activities to the general public in different kind of events. And those moments have been very, very fun for us, but also for those people who have participated to these activities. Then FFF, the people at Functional Foods Forum, we have got together for fun activities so many times during these years. And then we have also learned to enjoy the business and science and pleasure many times together, but also separately. And then one photo, which is now last but the least, it includes Seppo here, and I want to thank Seppo for everything. Tomorrow is the last day at the University of Turku when Seppo will be my boss, and we have a long history together, 20 years. So thank you for all your support and all the support, and thank you for being my personal mentor. It really has meant a lot to me during these years. And in the end, I want to say happy anniversary to also my dear Functional Foods Forum. And the list of the names here, they are those people that have been working in the group of Senses and Food team during the past 20 years. The list is pretty long. You all, every one of you, you have an important place in my heart and in my memories and in my brains. I will always remember you. Then thank you also for all the co-workers and collaborators during the past 20 years. I thank you for your attention, and this was now the end of the first phase of the Food Taste Finland program, the end.
Thank you very much, Mari. This is you gave a wonderful overview of the 20-year path of sensory studies at Functional Foods Forum. Now, if we have this Q&A session of this Sophie's and Mari's presentations, shall we start from the? Maybe we start from the chat. Yes.
Right on. We take the first question, and that goes to Sophie. Why do you think there is a difference between girls and boys in acceptance of different tasting solutions?
Thank you for this question. Thank you also for having me here. I really regret I can't be present with you. I think these differences are related to a number of factors. Then first, as I showed, there are very early differences in how boys and girls are fed. And this is some results we observed in France. And I don't know how well this would translate to other cohorts, but for sure, this is a relatively robust observation that we drove from our studies. Then we know there are physiological differences between boys and girls. Boys need a bit more calories, they are fed more. So how this imprints their sensory system is relatively unknown in general, but my thoughts are that this higher amount of food ingested is also likely to modulate differently the sensory system.
Thank you, Sophie. We have another question coming to you as well. Has taste preferences been matched with gut microbiota compositions in children?
Very, very interesting question, and a very hot topic indeed. I was very, very happy to listen to Seppo and Gabrielle in the previous talks, because actually we're currently running studies to understand the relationships between microbe or fermented food in consumption, allergy prevention, and food and taste preference development in children. And I have the gut feeling, if I may say so, that there are strong connections between all these factors. Of course, we are far from knowing anything about this. All that we know from a collaboration in an European cohort including Finnish colleagues from the University of Helsinki, named the Pasture Cohort, is that the consumption of cheese in children between the age of 12 and 18 months was associated to a reduction in the risk of developing allergic disease, such as atopic dermatitis and food allergies. And we currently want to expand this finding in the case of a randomized control trial, where we do control for the ingestion of fermented food in children, in a group of children in France, and also to understand the relationship between the development of preference. And my assumption is that there is a strong connection between immunity and preference, but it's something yet to be explored further. And so was really fascinated by the vision of Seppo about the role of fermented food in, of course, in the association with gut microbiota diversity. But I think it opens still a lot of research areas for scientists.
Yes. Now yes.
Yes, Sophie, a question from the audience here in Turku also, Ingmar Wester from Raisio Group. You showed that there was a difference in disliking and liking in the babies. And now my question is that, do you know whether there's an impact on the diet of the pregnant mother on the outcome?
Yeah. We explored this in particular in the context of the Opaline cohort, looking at the influence of maternal diet during pregnancy and lactation. Because, of course, the work by Julie Menella at Monell Chemical Sciences Center, with whom I worked when I was in Philadelphia together with Murray, she showed previously that early flavor exposure through amniotic fluid or breast milk are likely to imprint flavor preferences in babies. So we wanted to expand a little bit this finding. And indeed, we were able to show, that was in the context of the thesis by Sandra Wagner in our group, that consumption of some foods by mothers were likely to be associated to a reduction of negative reaction to the flavors of these foods when infants were exposed to these flavors at 8 or 12 or 13 months of age. And this was also related to a lower rejection of these foods. So in fact, these early exposure helped to reduce the negative reactions. We were not really able that they were useful to increase positive reactions to food, as we could see that from an early age on, we could differentiate between pleasant or unpleasant food flavors. So it's really in the sense that it's protecting against negative reaction. But of course, there is ideas of early imprinting. Again, as sensory scientists, when we look at this, we tend to look at the flavor component part. We probably disregard too much the microbiota influence on this. And we know there's one, as was reminded by Seppo, the influence of the very early events on the maturation of gut microbiota is now very well known. And we know that, as was reminded as well, that breast milk is indeed a very perfect example of very microbiota-rich food that's also flavorful. So again, a very strong connection between these two types of exposure, sensory and biotic one.
Wonderful.
What is the contribution of each of them is largely unknown.
Wonderful, thank you. I think we need to move on.
There is one question to Mari.
Okay.
Yes. And the question is, could you summarize the next steps in the Food Taste Finland?
I'm not able to do it in 30 seconds, so I'm not able to summarize it. I just say, like Seppo said, that it looks good.
That's good. Yes, thank you, Sophie, and thank you, Mari. And now we will continue to our next session. As I said earlier, we have planned this event to celebrate our 20-year-old history, but most importantly, we want to shed light for the future and contribute to the solving of future challenges, food challenges. And we do not make our food choices only for our own personal joy and pleasure and well-being. We need to understand that by our everyday food choices, we also have effect on well-being of our planet. And we now move on from individual to global perspectives. And FFF is proud to be a member of one of Professor Ilari Sääksijärvi's multidisciplinary research consortiums. Ilari is a professor of biodiversity research and the director of the biodiversity unit at University of Turku. He's also vice chairman of the Finnish Nature Panel, and Ilari has been studying the biodiversity in the Amazon since 1998 and has tackled the issue of nature loss by identifying and naming previously unknown species. I don't know how many new species you have found, but that's impressive, really. And currently, Ilari leads 2 large multidisciplinary research consortiums on biodiversity funded by Academy of Finland and Strategic Research Council. And in our seminar, Ilari will now explain how biodiversity loss is threatening the future of humankind. And although the title is quite sort of dark, you promised to give us tools to positively affect the course. So Ilari, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Anu, for the very nice introduction. And good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for the invitation to join this seminar today. I'm very happy to be here. And actually, as you heard, my background is a little bit different than the background of most of you in this hall. So I thought that I will first start with a short introduction on the biodiversity research that is happening in the University of Turku at the moment. So I will just explain you what are we doing at the moment, and then I will introduce you to the concept of biodiversity, which is not as simple as we normally think, and then to the concept of biodiversity loss. And at the end of my presentation, I will also tell you a little bit about the new research consortia that we have just started in the University of Turku. But first of all, I would also like to congratulate 3Fs for the anniversary. So congratulations. So let's start with the presentation. As Anu told you, my own background is mainly in Amazonia and tropical Andes. So for the past 20 years or so, I have been working mainly in the Amazonian lowland rainforest areas, but also in the tropical Andes of Peru, and also a little bit in Central America. And my own research team has been discovering new animal species, and we have been quite successful in finding new animal species or unknown animal species. So during the years, we have discovered hundreds of new species, and we have named about 200 animal species. And we are doing that every year. So every year we are naming new species, and that is, for me, it's a kind of childhood dream. When I was a young boy, I wanted to go to the rainforest areas and discover new species, and that is something that I have been lucky to do during the last 20 years. So I have spent like 2 or 3 years of my life in the field, and I'm always dreaming of new field trips. But at the same time, I'm also studying other aspects of biodiversity, and I'm very happy to collaborate with many other fields of research and many talented researchers. And as Anu told you, I'm currently leading these 2 large research consortia, Biodiform and Biodiful. Biodiform means biodiversity and the need for systemic transformation. It's a multidisciplinary interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary research consortia that includes activities from 3 different faculties of the University of Turku. And then the STN-funded Beautiful, it includes like 15 different fields of research, and it's a very interesting group of people, and we are trying to study the leadership or the biodiversity leadership interface, which is quite active at the moment, and we are trying to find new ways to tackle the global biodiversity loss. But my main job is to direct or to lead the University of Turku Biodiversity Unit, which is a quite large unit. We have about 70 people working in the biodiversity unit, and we are all working on topics related to climate change or biodiversity loss. And we have actually quite interesting places represented in the biodiversity unit. We have vast natural history collections, which can be compared to biobanks actually. They are kind of biodiversity banks. So we have about 5 million natural history specimens, or specimens of animals, plants and fungi, collected from all over the world during the last 300 years or so. So they are kind of research collection that we are keeping for the future research needs. And we are also housing the biological research collections of the Åbo Academy University here in the University of Turku. Then we have the botanical garden, which houses a living collection of about 5,500 plant species. And we have the aerobiology unit, which is quite well known for its pollen forecasts that we are producing for the national TV and radio stations on a daily basis. And then we have science and Luma centers, which are dedicated to children's science and environmental education. And then we still have 2 research stations in the island of Seili and another in Kebo, in Utsjoki Kebo. So the natural history collections are quite interesting. We are actually housing also the oldest natural history collections in Finland. For example, that collection was saved from the big fire of Turku in 1827. So they form a kind of basis for understanding the Finnish biodiversity. And of course, we are also collecting new samples all the time. So we are collecting thousands of samples on every year for the research collection. And then the botanical garden is also one of the most famous tourist attractions in the Turku area. It is visited in excess of about 100,000 visitors each year. So it offers very good possibilities for the University of Turku to do some active public outreach activities. And then we have these research stations. I'm sure that many of you have already visited the island of Seili or the Kevo subarctic research station. You are all most welcome to those research stations. For example, if you want to have some writing retreats or something like that with your research teams, you are most welcome to use those resources also in the future. And then we have these pollen forecasts. And this is a very important and interesting brand in the University of Turku. The pollen forecasts that we are producing for the national TV and radio stations reaches about 1 million Finnish people on a daily basis. So it's one of the strongest brands in the University of Turku, and very important for all the Finnish people who suffer from pollen allergy. And then still we have these science and Luma centers, which are dedicated to children's environmental and science and science education. And as you can see, we are, for example, teaching how to produce food. So in the botanical garden, we have dedicated a quite large part of the botanical garden for children's activities. So for example, Turku kindergarten kids are actually planting our edible plants in the springtime, and then they are harvesting the plants in the autumn. And by that way, we hope that they learn how to produce food for people. But at a larger scale, the University of Turku is quite active in biodiversity research at the moment. As you know, we have these 6 thematic collaborations on research and education or profiling areas. And I'm extremely proud that actually biodiversity is mentioned in those profiling areas or thematic collaborations, because all the Finnish universities are concentrating on sustainable development at the moment, and it is very important. It is important that all the universities are concentrating on that subject. But at the moment, the University of Turku is still the only Finnish university that has highlighted also biodiversity loss and biodiversity in the thematic collaboration. And that means a lot to me, and I really hope that we can also promote new transdisciplinary research within the University of Turku. And I think that we have already been quite successful in doing that. We have, for example, this Biodiform consortia, which is trying to tackle the global biodiversity loss by transdisciplinary research. So this is a research consortia that has activities in 3 different faculties, in the Faculty of Science and in the Turku School of Economics, but also in the Faculty of Humanities. So we know that we natural scientists, we can actually describe what is biodiversity, and we can describe the trends happening in nature. How is biodiversity, how we see the future of biodiversity, but we cannot tackle the biodiversity loss alone. We have to understand better, for example, the human behavior, and that's the main reason why we need the help of other fields of studies, and that's one of the reasons why we have, for example, the Faculty of Humanities with us. We are also concentrating on the human nature or human biodiversity relationship in this very large research consortia. This is led by the University of Turku Biodiversity Unit together with the Turku School of Economics. So we are concentrating on this interface between economy and biodiversity, which is really interesting and active at the moment also internationally. But then I'm also happy to know this and happy to say that we have many research projects in studying biodiversity in many different faculties at the moment, not only in these large consortia. For example, this Humbio project is also a project which is led by the Faculty of Humanities. It's led by the Otto Latva, by the postdoctoral researcher Otto Latva. It's one example of biodiversity research taking place outside of the Faculty of Science. And then there are other activities, for example, in archaeology and also in philosophy, and they are all studying biodiversity. So it has been, for me personally, it has been very important to know this, that so many different fields of science are actually concentrating on biodiversity at the moment. And it's very important because, as you know, climate change has been a very hot topic in both academia and society for the last 20 years or so. But at the same time, biodiversity loss has gained much less attention. But biodiversity loss as a global challenge is as severe as climate change, and they should be tackled together. So we have to concentrate on biodiversity loss also in the future, at the same time when we are trying to tackle climate change. So what is the main reason why are we concentrating so much on biodiversity here in the University of Turku at the moment? One of the most important reasons is that we are still living in an unknown planet. And by this I mean that about 80% of all the species, for example, are still unknown. And that means that it is still quite difficult also to conserve biodiversity when we don't even know how many species there are on Earth. So about 20% of the species are known, and that is something that we are doing a lot in Turku. So we are trying to discover new species, and as you can see, they are not some small brown-looking species, but they are quite colorful species and quite large-sized in size also. Here are some examples which are my favorites at the moment. Lauredia phoenixi is a new species of velvet spider that was just discovered and described for science by one of our graduate students, Alireza Samani. It's a very beautiful species, and in the name Lauredia phoenixi, the specific epithet phoenixi refers to Joaquin Phoenix, who is the main actor of the Joker movie, and he's a nature conservationist also. So actually Alireza described this species in honor of Joaquin Phoenix, and it's a very nice looking species. And then on the right side of the image you can see some of the species that I have been working with during the last few years. I'm a wasp specialist myself, and these are some of the wasp species that we have discovered from Amazonia during the last few years, and those belong to the genus Hymenopimecys. And Hymenopimecys, they are quite large in size and they are quite beautiful, as you can see, but they are also very interesting because they can actually manipulate the behavior of other species chemically. So that is quite interesting. Their biology is also, or their behavior is also hugely interesting. So this is the basic research on biodiversity that we are doing, but at the same time, the second reason why we are concentrating so much on biodiversity is the global biodiversity loss. So this is one of the largest global challenges that we are facing nowadays, and it's a huge challenge. We are in risk of losing like 1 million species within the next few decades. So the situation is quite critical at the moment, and we should be able to find good solutions for tackling biodiversity loss during the next 10 years. We can't wait more. So we are in a hurry, and we should find very good ways to stop the biodiversity loss. One example is the kind of world global shaper classification by World Economic Forum. It was published a couple of years ago, and they actually elevated biodiversity loss to the same level with climate change, or failure with the climate change actions. So we have 5 different environmental global shapers in the world that are threatening the future of biodiversity and of the planet Earth and of the humankind also, and biodiversity loss is actually one of them. So it's a very large global challenge that is moving on at an accelerating pace at the moment. But why biodiversity loss has not been such a hot topic like climate change? I think one of the reasons is that people do not understand very well what is biodiversity. I suppose that many of you already think that it is a simple thing. We all know what is biodiversity, but when we go outside of the academia, people do not understand biodiversity quite well yet. And I think one of the main reasons is that we biodiversity researchers, we have been extremely talented in complicating the concept in many ways. So if you ask from me as a biodiversity researcher, what is biodiversity? I start to explain you things about genetic diversity and species diversity and all the different dimensions of ecological diversity. And that gets really confusing very soon. And because of that, we have tried to simplify the concept of biodiversity during the last few years. For example, last year we published a new definition here in Finland together with my colleague Janne Kotiaho, who is the chair of the Finnish Nature Panel. We defined biodiversity as life in all its different dimensions. So that is all that you have to remember of biodiversity. It's a kind of synonym of life. The biodiversity means life in all its different dimensions. You don't have to remember anything about genetic diversity, species diversity, different dimensions of ecological diversity. So it is quite easy concept to understand by that way. And that is enough for me, for example. As a biodiversity researcher, I do not want to use those very complicated definitions of biodiversity. But at the same time, we have to remember that it's also quite complicated because when the concept of biodiversity was introduced to the world in 1986 in the National Science Forum in the United States, after that, the concept of biodiversity has been used as a political concept also. So it has a very strong political charge, and it also complicates the definition of biodiversity nowadays. And that's one of the reasons why we have tried to, for example, this year we published a paper saying that we should think also biodiversity as a kind of cross-cutting concept in the future, not only as a biological concept. And then there is another very complicated term, which is biodiversity loss. But it's not so complicated, actually. Biodiversity loss means that when we are destroying biodiversity by human impact, then we are causing biodiversity loss. And because biodiversity loss has been happening for a very long time, it is not something that it's not a new thing. It has happened already since the for the last 200 or 300 years, when humans have used nature in a very heavy way, biodiversity loss has been happening in nature, and that's one of the reasons why we are using nowadays also the term biodiversity crisis. So in a similar way, and people are not talking about climate change nowadays, people are already using the term climate crisis. In the same way, we are not only using biodiversity loss nowadays, but we are also using the concept of biodiversity crisis, which is a little bit more severe concept. And then we still have one more concept, which is mass extinction. And many biodiversity researchers also in Finland think that we have already entered the era of mass extinction. But I'm a little bit more positive, and I think that we still have a possibility to stop the biodiversity crisis or biodiversity loss before we enter to the era of mass extinction. Because if we enter to the era of mass extinction, then we are in big trouble. Because as I said, we are, according to the latest research, we are in risk of losing 1 million species within the next few decades. And if you think that we have about 8 million species or 10 million or probably 10 million species on Earth, we are in risk of losing a huge proportion of all the species. And they don't go extinct alone. Species always draw other species with them when they vanish. In Finland, we also know that biodiversity loss is advancing quite rapidly. In Finland, we are in a very lucky situation because the biodiversity in Finland is one of the best known on Earth. We have such a huge amount of data on biodiversity and on biodiversity trends. And for example, Finnish Biodiversity Information Facility is also one example. University of Helsinki is coordinating the Finnish Biodiversity Information Facility, but the University of Turku has been one of the contributors of the data already for the last 10 years or so. And for example, in this Finnish Biodiversity Information Facility, there is a huge amount of open data on biodiversity. We have already about more than in excess of 40 million observations on Finnish biodiversity in the Finnish Biodiversity Information Facility, and that is open data. So all of you can actually enter that data and you can use it. And by using that data, Finnish researchers have been able to evaluate the status of most of Finnish species. So in Finland we have about 50,000 species of animals, plants and fungi, and we have been able to evaluate the status of about 25,000 species. And unfortunately, I have to say that about 12% of all the species that have been evaluated in Finland are threatened. So their risk of extinction is elevated. So that is a tricky situation in Finland also. And of course, in many other parts of the world, biodiversity loss is advancing even more rapidly than in Finland. And what are the main drivers of biodiversity loss? IPBES, which is an intergovernmental platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services, published a very large global report on biodiversity in 2019. And that report was actually based on 15,000 scientific research articles. And they defined the 5 major drivers behind the global biodiversity loss. And as you can see, many of those reasons are the same that are causing climate change. So the most important driver is the vast change that we are causing to the natural environments. So we have changed the natural ecosystems on Earth in a very drastic ways, and it has been said that we don't have any ecosystems anymore that are not impacted by human impact by somehow. So the situation is quite heavy at the moment, and as you all know, we are using natural resources in a very drastic way. And then the second most important driver behind biodiversity loss is the direct exploitation of species. We still have species, for example, some tuna species that we are fishing too much, and we have some some other vertebrate species that we are hunting too much, for example, big cat species, etc. Their populations do not stand that hunting pressure that we are causing to those species. And that is one of the reasons why we are causing biodiversity loss in such a rapid pace. And then climate change is, of course, one of the reasons. And climate change is very important, for example, here in Finland or in other northern areas. For example, we have loads of species that will go extinct within the next few decades because they don't have those temperatures that they need in their life cycles anymore. And then pollution, for example, including pesticides, is one of the important reasons. And as you know, for example, in the biodiversity unit, there is a group which is led by Professor Kari Saikkonen. They are concentrating on glyphosate, on the ecosystem effects of glyphosate. It's a pesticide that we have been using a lot during the last decades, but we haven't checked whether it has drastic effects on natural ecosystems or on our health. But now Kari Saikkonen and his group is quite active in glyphosate research. And we have many other insecticides and pesticides that we are using in vast quantities. And then our actions are also spreading invasive alien species to the new areas in the world. And those invasive alien species, many times they are quite heavy competitors of the native species, and they drive other species even to extinction in many parts of the world. And as you can know, even in Turku area, we have problems with invasive alien species. We have loads of very important alien species, for example, in the Baltic Sea or Archipelago Sea, and also here in the campus area, actually. And unfortunately, despite all the efforts, biodiversity loss is continuing at an accelerating pace at the moment, or very rapidly. But it is very important to know that there are many positive things happening also. For example, the European Union published a new biodiversity strategy 2 years ago. And it's a very heavy strategy, and there are many good tools that will help to tackle the biodiversity loss. And this year is actually a kind of super year of biodiversity. We will see an international meeting of biodiversity, and I really hope that those tools that have been stated in the European Union's biodiversity strategy, they will be actually global tools in the future. So many good things are also happening. Biodiversity loss is not only a presentation of only negative trends, but many good things are happening. So that is something that I hope that you will remember. And as I said, although I have to work with biodiversity on a daily basis, and I have to read all those scientific articles showing biodiversity loss and all the reports on a daily basis, I'm actually quite positive also. As a person, I like to be quite positive, and I believe that it is still possible to tackle biodiversity loss in the same way that it is still possible to tackle climate change. Of course, we will lose huge quantities of species, but it is still possible to save many more. But we have to work quickly. We don't have any more time to wait. And as I said at the beginning of my presentation, I think that we should take those tools into action within the next 10 years maximum. If we don't do that, then we will be in great trouble, because we always have to remember that also the well-being and health and security economy of humankind depends on nature. Finland is a great example. If we lose our forests, if we lose the biodiversity present in our forests, our economy will collapse very rapidly. If biodiversity loss continues, we will see more pandemics happening in the future. And you all know that there is a strong connection between the human well-being, human health, and the well-being of biodiversity. But that's if we want to if we want to change the world, then we have to change the academic biodiversity research also, and that is something that we are doing in the University of Turku. We are trying to maintain the basic biodiversity research that we are doing, but at the same time we are developing these new research consortia, which are very transdisciplinary and kind of represent a totally new way to study biodiversity. And I'm very happy that, for example, food science and Anu's group is also involved in this new STN project. We just got a 4.2 million euros funding for this beautiful consortium. And in this consortium, we are, for example, we are trying to study the change in leadership that is needed in order to tackle the global biodiversity loss. And we are not only concentrating on kind of transformational leadership, that is like, for example, leading companies or leading societies, but we are also trying to study the emergent leadership. So how could we change the behavior of every individual? How can we all change our behavior in order that the planet could be a little bit better place to live in the future, and a little bit nicer place also for the rest of the biodiversity. And this is a project that we have just started this year. We got funded last year, but the actions of the project started this year, and I'm extremely proud of this consortia. We have, at the moment, we have about 20 researchers working in the group, and they represent like 15 different fields of sciences. So we are really trying to study biodiversity in a totally new way, not only from the biological perspective that has been normally used in biodiversity research. And this is a really exciting new way to study biodiversity. And what is most important, we are also collaborating with loads of companies, with large companies also, so we are really trying to make a change during the next 3 years, or hopefully during the next 6 years. So we have a 3-year funding, but we really hope that we can do some breakthroughs and get that second phase funding also for the consortium. And we have a very large co-creation network also. So we have a huge amount of people also outside of the academia working with the beautiful consortium. If you are interested on this consortium, we are just publishing our new web pages soon, and there will be a blog also. So we will highlight all the new research results that are that have been conducted by our consortium. So you are most welcome to ask more questions on Beautiful also, and visit our web pages. And then the last thing that I would like to advertise you is the BioBlitz event that we are organizing in 3 weeks in the International Day of Biodiversity. I think that the University of Turku and Åbo Akademi campus is one of the most biodiverse campus areas in the whole world. We have, for example, grey seals in the campus area. In Aurajoki, they come almost to the Tuomiokirkko. And we have many more species living inside of the campus buildings, also in this building, I suppose, besides of our species. And we have many rare and threatened species living in the campus area. And actually in this BioBlitz event, we will inventory all the species that live in our campus area, and we will use 24 hours for that. And there will be plenty of program for children also, and for families also. So if you want to learn how we study different groups of animals, plants, fungi, etc., you are most welcome to visit this BioBlitz and to talk with our biodiversity researchers. This is kind of basic biodiversity research, but it's interesting anyhow. So with these words, I would like to finish my presentation. We are always nowadays using the slogan luontokadon pysäyttäminen on elämän suojelua, stopping biodiversity loss is saving life. I think that is a good take-home message that you could remember from my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ilari. Yes, and yes, and as I said, we are really proud to be part of your this beautiful consortium. And our role is really biodiversity awareness and consumer behavior, food behavior. Yes, but now I noticed that I have actually been really bad chairperson, because we are really running out of, late in schedule. So would it be okay that we will skip the Q&A sessions and continue?
Yes, and you are most welcome to send me an email.
Yep.
And I also included my Twitter account there, so please contact me by. I'm a very lazy person to answer all the emails, but I'm very quick in answering the personal messages in Twitter. So.
Great, good. That's
Okay,
good to know. Thank you very much, Ilari. Thanks. Yes, and now we move on to the last session of this event, and we will focus on future of food, especially on technology and innovations in the food chain. And we will first hear recorded presentation by Erkki Sutinen, Professor of Computer Science and Interaction Design at the University of Turku. And since 2019, Erkki has been working in Namibia and set up the first overseas campus at University of Turku, or of University of Turku. And it's currently located at premises of University of Namibia. Erkki has been researching educational technology, computing education, information and communication technology for development, and co-design. And he will now share his expertise in Africa, discussing co-designing technologies for the food chain, and the presentation is recorded. So, Erkki, please, welcome.
So good afternoon, everyone, from Windhoek, Namibia. I'm actually here directing the Future Technology Lab of the University of Turku, which is also the only and first overseas campus of any universities in Finland, anywhere in the world. It's called Future Technology Lab because, we want to get inspired by the African challenges and co-design solutions with people here, with the young people here. And one of these opportunities and sort of inspirations or even demands here in Africa, of course, is the food chain especially. And now we see how we can co-design new technologies for an improved food chain by African imaginations. Many people say that Africa is poor, but Africa actually is rich. I think that it's probably the richest continent. For several reasons. The nature is just amazing. And it's not just one savanna or one desert. It's diverse, it's most diverse. And in terms of ingredients for food, whatever, minerals, tourism, whatever, it's just beautiful and amazing and rich. We have sunshine. We have an amazing climate. A lot of variations in climate. In terms of culture and social structures, we have those full range and they are complementing each other in a beautiful way. Just in Namibia, we have about 2.5 million people, about 15 different languages. And you might have a meeting with 10 people and you speak 10 different languages. We have young, curious people. Europe is aging. But here you can have the young power, hundreds of people, young, who are hungry for learning, not just for food. However, if I think of this richness, I'm just going through a couple of claims that I have heard over the years. I didn't really check most of these. But when I was in Mozambique for a couple of years, I heard that, and that was 10 years ago, I heard that 80 to 19% of arable land in Mozambique is not used for farming. So that's another fact for that shows, the potential and richness of this continent. Just Maputo could get like 4 harvests, or the area, rural area around farming area about Maputo could get like 4 harvests of maize each year. Namibia, said one agricultural scientist, could even outperform Kenya in producing quality vegetables for export because of our dry climate. So we don't need that much like for example pesticides or other measures, you know, for the quality products. Way back, and that's way back. We actually went for our honeymoon in Senegal, and that's like, okay, that's was like in the early 80s. There were a lot of blind people, and we heard that, you know, blindness was to the lack of vitamin A. At the same time, you know, country was full of mango trees, but not really consumed. So another indication of the potential that was just not used. I heard from a Ugandan banker that Uganda just as a country could feed the whole Africa. I have not double checked this, but this tells about the potential and richness of Africa. However, there is poverty. And why is it poverty? Why there is poverty? I can identify like 3 reasons: logistics, culture, and knowledge. In terms of logistics, the wealth does not meet those in demand. In terms of culture, those in authority, whether they are teachers, politicians, elders, usually they require discipline in following, you know, the current authorized, but many times outdated practices or irrelevant practices. Knowledge, if you think of schooling, school gives a lot of knowledge, but most young people say that it doesn't make so much sense for life. It's just too general, too generic, rather than contextualized and functional. So all these reasons have also to do with technology, or we can use technology actually to help intervene into these factors. If you think of poverty and especially the reasons, we can see that poverty breaks in terms of whether it's logistics, whether it's culture, whether it's knowledge. It actually breaks the food chain at its every step. If you think of these different you know, steps of the food chain, accessing fertile land with water, planning farming, growing food, sourcing ingredients to the kitchen, preparing healthy food, presenting the food in an aesthetic way for all senses, enjoying the food with gratitude, or recycling the leftovers. We see that, you know, poverty actually concretizes here. If you think of just accessing fertile land with water, still in most places, for most young people, for example, it's very, very hard to actually get access to their own land where they would be able to cultivate things. Planning farming, what you learn at school, maybe you don't learn these things at all at school, but it still can be very generic. It doesn't help you to do your own farming. Then if you see like sourcing ingredients to the kitchen, we might still be way too much restricted by certain cultural traditions or habits, which means that we can't really like enjoy the whole range of ingredients that would be available. Enjoying the food with gratitude, the enjoyment factor, it's maybe even sometimes I think that it's kind of even hidden or even not allowed. Might have something to do with culture, might have also something to do with education. And these are the things that actually are making everyone think that Africa is poor rather than rich. The 3 I's that I would like to discuss for a sustainable food chain are imagination, invention, and innovation. And somehow I feel that, you know, all these 3 I's somehow have connotations to this classic values, although very European, of liberty, fraternity, and equality of our European societies. If you think of imagination, that requires liberty, so that we are free to imagine. Invention requires fraternity, love, solidarity, empathy. If you go to the Nobel Museum in Stockholm, you can actually see how the great scientists were inspired by, for example, the diseases that their maybe parents or their loved ones suffered from. So that actually made them to invent. So they got the passion, from the environment and from their passion to love each other. Innovation. I think innovation is something that really requires equality. It means that everyone can contribute. Everyone is equal, everyone is needed. And let's have a look like how we can make use of these. I think that much too often we nowadays just emphasize innovation, not even invention or imagination, whereas everything starts from imagination. If we go now from the European aspects to Africa, I'm quite curious how we can actually Africanize, these I's by Ubuntu. The African philosophy means that I am because we all are. How can Africanization and how can Ubuntu transform imagination, especially imagination, beyond its usual common individualistic interpretation, which emphasizes liberty and freedom, individualism? I think that the key thing here is co-imagining. So we don't just imagine as individuals, but we imagine together. We need like the diversity of people that imagine and then later also invent and innovate solutions by sharing and recombining their unique contributions. So this would be like particularly the African approach in many ways, but in this case we emphasize how African imagination or co-imagination can result in this sustainable food chain by using technology. So I had a look at this and I tried to see like how for each of these steps in the food chain, we can think of a few technologies. We could also think of many other technologies, but I just took here like Internet of Things, robotics, artificial intelligence, and on the other hand, remote presence. Remote presence refers to technology whereby in two different places, or maybe even more, but let's think of two places, you can actually feel that you are not only in your own place, but you use technology, like for example, HoloLens, to feel that you are in two places at the same time. Say that you are in Turku, but at the same time, you are on a farm in Namibia, and you see both at the same time. We already have that technology available to some extent. We are actually developing it in an Academy of Finland funded project. Let's have a look of some of these. The first kind of factor that actually brings in the poverty is in this accessing fertile land with water. If we think of using AI, so we actually can make a better, more efficient, culturally sensitive use of available land. So we start from available land, but we use sensors, for example, to make its use more efficient. Or then also we can talk about more culturally more sensitive use of the land. Or if we think of remote presence, so then we talk about how experts can join in accessing the land, how they can actually join the others, say from Finland, they can join, on the farm where we are right there, at the place. If you think of planning farming, so we can better utilize facts from the actual land because we have sensors that actually tell about different, for example, the amount of water, humidity, or just nutrition in the land. And then planning farming with experts means that we are co-planning it. So we are using remote presence to plan it. Sourcing ingredients to the kitchen. By technology, we can learn the sources for quality ingredients. We can identify a much wider range of ingredients that are there available, but people just didn't think of using them. or then using remote presence, we can co-imagine the way that we are using existing ingredients. Presenting the food in an aesthetic way for all senses. I think that like this sort of presentation is the thing that requires aesthetics, but of course aesthetics is also culturally sensitive issue. And when we can use, for example, sensors to actually observe and analyze how the aesthetics, how the presentation is adaptive to the particular cultural setting, we can actually expand and deepen the aesthetic experience. And then, of course, by remote presence, we can get feedback on the presentation. And this actually means all the senses. And not only like visual presentation, we can also use other senses. Enjoying the food with gratitude. One of the key things is that we can share experience, like how everyone was enjoying the food in a share setting. Again, if we go to the sensor technology, we can reflect on the food in comparison with earlier menus. We can see like how our current food is different from what we used to have earlier. So all in all, when we think of co-imagining the food chain, we can actually break the barriers and restrictions based on logistics, culture, and knowledge that prevent us from really like making use of all the richness that Africa would otherwise provide for the food chain. We can go to the other level. And this requires that we work together, we use technology, and then we see the results and in a completely new, novel way. This is also what we want to do at our lab here in Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Erkki, for your sharing your African perspectives on African road for innovation. And now we will move on to our last scientific presentation. We continue with innovation here in Finland. And our last speaker is Reetta Kivelä, entrepreneur and professor of practice at University of Helsinki. And Reetta has a doctoral degree in food chemistry, and she's also a co-founder of Golden Green Foods Limited and inventor of pulled oats, the Nyhtökaura invention that we know, as well as co-founder of the Nordic Umami company, which is a newcomer in this field. And in her work, Reetta is dedicated to building sustainable food systems and currently dividing her time between University of Helsinki and her company. And now, Reetta, you will share with us your thoughts about the role of food innovations in the food chain. Looking forward to hear. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Anu. So nice to be here, and thank you, Mari, for inviting me. I think this is the first time in these premises, even though you are already 20 years old, so it's a good time to be here. And congratulations for FFF. I come from Viikki, and Viikki is also a campus in Helsinki, and we have just opened Viikki Food Design Factory, which is an innovation platform for food innovators who have a dream or idea and who just want to make it a little bit more commercial. And with Laura Forsman, who is also there sitting, we are running the Wikifood Design Factory and coaching there. And actually, we just opened today the call for our next Terminator, which is a pre-incubator program. So please, everyone who has an invention or any ideas, apply in. It was really much fun the first time. Great. So I'm glad to speak a little bit about food innovations. This is not anything scientific. This is more about opinion and views. So it's more about entertainment for the rest of the time here. I just wanted to start about the fact that if thinking about food innovations, our playground has been changing. We have been talking a lot about functional foods and healthy related foods here, because that is something that we are good at. And that has been kind of like more like a choice for companies, so that we want to be forerunners and we want to be competitive and so on, so that we could make, for example, something for the public health and make something innovative products, for example, functional food. And of course, it's always there, because food will be always related to the health and it's always important. But we have another player there as well, and it's the crisis that we are having in our food system and environment. As we already heard, one of my favorite topics, biodiversity, it's lots of related to our food system as well as climate change. So we have like an external force to do something, and that is changing the question. We don't need to ask anymore in companies why should we innovate, but it's more like how should we and what should we do. So how is more the question now. What are the solutions to make so that we can change the food system? And also we have new players in the field. So this food startup bubble is coming bigger every year. And as we can see, for example, this is one statistics just showing how the investment money and the private money is growing year by year. And last year was really successful in Europe. And it means that at least the money believes that there is something in the food system that needs to be changed, and it's worth of putting money in. And this is the same trend also not only in Europe, not only in USA, but also in Nordic countries and in Finland, and that's something that we can be really proud of. Even though we are a small one, we are really like having lots of ideas and putting the companies or starting the companies. Of course, it's good to remember that most of this money still goes to the delivery solutions, and the delivery solutions rarely has anything to do with sustainability or healthiness. It's only getting the food easier or faster. But this orange one is for these delivery solutions. But then these all others are mostly for the sustainability solutions, and also some like a functional food there. So we can notice that the money that is the private investment money that is put into these innovations, it's raising all the time, and now there is the right time to try your own wings if there is an idea. And also, just an example, this is one article about the patents and the sustainability-oriented agri-food sector patents, which means that there is lots of going on, and also like government money for the sustainability research. And I also put these like shelves there behind, because if there are patents, if there are startups, and if there are innovation actions, usually there are also lots of new products on the shelves. That is actually quite easy to notice here in Finland, at least. So we have lots of different items on the shelves. We have lots of different blueberry yogurts. We have lots of different candy bags. We have lots of everything, and it's a little bit possibly confusing for the consumers. And it starts to be quite clear that we can't put all the decision making for the consumers' shoulders or on the consumer's shoulders. This article was about that one person was thinking that people are drowning in new food, and there should be something like more happening in the system and not always in the shelf of the supermarkets. And I think it's a really good point when we are having this like a really urgent need for change. And when thinking about food innovation, so we are usually just talking about innovations or functional food, but we should possibly understand that there are different kind of innovations. And usually in thinking about like what we have been doing years and years in big companies, it's usually incremental what we are doing. So we are just like doing small enhancing actions to the process or efficacy or the product itself. But when we are talking about this like a startup world, we are usually talking about disruptive or radical innovations, and we are looking for, quite often we are nowadays talking about deep tech and using these like technology newness terms. And if thinking about radical, for example, so I put these smoothies there because when the HPP technology came, we found a totally new category from the supermarket. So we were able to get these really fresh smoothies. And for example, this Onego Bio, that is a spin-off from Aalto University, it's making the egg white. And of course, if you can change the chicken technology or replace the chicken technology by this bioreactor technology, it's of course disruptive. So the consumer doesn't need to change anything, only accept the GMO, but nothing else. And then the consumer will get the exactly same product as before. So this is the idea of this map. And of course, sustaining is the old technology, so something that has always been there, but there is just a new need, and the positioning is the innovation. So that, for example, these protein products, they are usually exactly the same that has been there for years, but now they are just newly positioned. And also what is typical for innovations is that there are different horizons. So there may be an innovation that is changing something in consumers' habits, for example, or in the system, and it's doing its work. And then it's killed, and the other one is coming, and then the other one, another one, and possibly only after years the change is seen. So what I want to say with this picture is that all kind of innovations are possibly needed, because the role of some innovations may be like bridging, and so like starting the really old towards a little bit newer, but the newer is doesn't actually change anything. But when we go further and further and have like more generations of the innovation, then we can actually see the change. But all those different kind of innovations have been needed. And that's a quite important thing, at least for me, so that quite often we are waiting for the change or the something visible in a few years, but it doesn't it usually doesn't happen, and then after 10 years, the effect can be much more than we can even vision how big the change will be. So innovations always need time, as we all know here. And if thinking about this like a bridging effect and that fact that we need different kind of innovations and different level of innovations, also innovations from different angles, because food system is a huge one. So it's not only like a consumer's choice, it's not only what we are producing, it's not only the production itself, it's also policy, it's also society and culture, energy, lots of different drivers, lots of different actors in this complex food system. And what is one really important point in food system is that we are actually needing it every day. So we are all dependent on food system. So we can't just forget it for one day and take a new one. But what is quite important to remember always when thinking about these kind of system changes is that it's really slow, and as we are in urgent need, it needs that many actors are doing similar like same direction acts at the same time, so that it's not only so that we are not waiting that someone is doing it somewhere, but it's like many different things happening at the same time. And I just wanted to give an example because what I tried to explain you. So, for example, there are has been innovators who has been concerned about animal protein production related greenhouse gas emissions. So they have thought that this is the answer. If I could do something so that I could reduce those this production related greenhouse gas emissions, then the world would be better. And then people have been thinking, what could I do with my expertise? And for example, this alternative protein product innovations has been born. And if thinking about these different kind of innovations, so we have there lots of those just incrementals and new like positioning, really old technologies that has been just created for the new customer or new customer need. But then we have also those a little bit more radical that has developed a new technology and are, for example, full dose is utilizing just a familiar user interface, but not trying to be as meat. And then there is Impossible Food, which like a strategy is to be exactly like meat, so you don't need to sacrifice anything because they say that it's similar than hamburger. Okay, we all have opinion, is it or not, but that is the strategy. And then, of course, if we have the meat, so it's grown in laboratory, but it's the same meat, then we don't need to sacrifice anything. So even though we are talking about alternative protein product innovations, there are lots of different strategies, lots of different drivers and ideas where to start from, and lots of room as well. So my message is possibly here that even though the consumer starts to be a little bit confused, and even though there is happening already a lot, there is still room. I think that only the first generation has been now developed. But what is even more important is that this same question can be started to solve out within a very different ways. It's not only the products, like one other product, what we are putting into the shelves, but it's also about the system change. And as we know, we have lots of going on also in Finland about these agri-system innovations. I tried to figure, or I gave these examples, so for example, database innovations, what we can do with handling data in our food chain. We can have more effective and optimized food chain. Or what if we would have renewable agriculturing, so that we would take care more about the soil microbes and think about fertilizers and so on. That's also going on a lot in Finland. And also there's this indoor farming, so that we would have a fully optimized farming conditions. That is one vision that we are having. And then also service and product innovations that are more taking or more thinking about the whole system. For example, Epic Food, that is a ghost restaurant serving vegan food vegan food, and that helps people to eat easier if it's difficult to cook vegan way, and so on and so on. So, and for example, our NAM company, I think it's also for the system innovations because it wants to circulate all the ingredients and then give the umami flavor for the plant protein industry. And then also we have these social and political or value innovations, which one of my favorite is Satokausikalenteri. That is so easy idea. So just reorganizing the vegetables in the retails, they have achieved really nice results, increasing the sales of vegetables. And then what Helsinki has, for example, done in their events, that's a lot also. And then one other my favorites is this restaurant menu from Telliskivi, Estonia. They are having all like vegetarian food as main food, and then meat is only as a sides. So it's kind of like a value innovation, so that we are changing our thinking and putting the vegetables more valuable than meat. Just quickly, did I go over already? Yes, okay. Nordic Umami Company I already mentioned, so our purpose is to accelerate the shift towards a fully sustainable food system. And how we are doing it, so we want to increase the plant-based eating but reduce the wastage and produce the natural umami by, it's actually quite multi-stage fermentation, so 3 steps fermentation and using the side streams. And this is actually the most important picture is thinking about Nordic Umami Company, because now we know that there is already this alternative protein industry, but it's only about producing the protein itself. And now it starts to be those companies who are supporting this new industry, and we are proud to be one of those. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, really. Thank you, Reetta, and thank you all the other speakers as well. And I think we covered this whole 20-year path of our FFF, and I think we understand as food scientists and food professionals that we need to continuously deepen our understanding on quite a wide range of food challenges. And I think also in FFF we have developed and widened our perspectives from scientifically proven healthy foods to tackle really wide range of future food challenges. And I think thank you, Reetta, for this great example on really combining all these different challenges: healthy food, sustainable food, via innovations and so on. And we really need to intertwine these new challenges with the old ones. And I'm afraid we need to skip the Q&A session once more, because I'm really sorry. It's because of me. I have been really lousy, really bad chairperson. So I'm sorry for this slight delay of the program. But finally, I would like to invite our Kirsi Laitinen here, because as Mari already mentioned, tomorrow will be the last working day of Seppo Salminen as director of Functional Foods Forum. And we are really thrilled and happy to invite our new director, Professor Kirsi Laitinen, and wish you to now not to close this session, but to open the coming decades of Functional Foods Forum. So Kirsi, please.
Thank you, Anu. And what a wonderful day today. It has really been a privilege to listen to all these presentations. The next 20 years of Functional Foods Forum, well, let's see. but I'm sure we will continue with the successful path that where we have seen the Functional Food Forum has been for the last 20 years. And the unit has been a forerunner in many areas, including research in the field of gut microbiota and probiotics, as we heard today from Professor Seppo Salminen's presentation. To mention another example, building the research platform Flavoria has been a huge effort of many active individuals as well as collaboration with many facets. The success comes along with skillful people striving for ambitious goals. And indeed, the personnel of the Functional Food Forum has already demonstrated that this is true. And surely further opportunities will arise from the joint efforts of many competent experts and collaboration at both national and international level. The research platforms and other facilities provided by the faculty and by the university are clear assets. And one of the recent achievements is the Academy of Finland funded National Research Infrastructure Food Nutri for climate smart food research. Food Nutri is coordinated by the University of Helsinki, but it unites all the experts in the field of food and nutrition in Finland. Including University of Turku. And the collaboration with stakeholders and societal players, including Health Campus Turku and City of Turku, just to mention a couple, are evenly valued. So hopefully together we will innovate and build up new research initiatives to provide further knowledge, deeper understanding and also practical solutions on the relations of food and nutrition and health. My background is in human nutrition research. Our main interest in our early nutrition and health research group are in associations of diet, metabolism and gut microbiota in relation to health. And we have been conducting several clinical trials. We have also an interest in developing methods for food evaluation, like assessment of dietary quality. But as important as deeper understanding of human physiology is, what eventually counts is behavior, and therefore we also have an interest in eating behavior and how that might influence health. I find the early life phases, pregnancy, breastfeeding and childhood very interesting ones and important ones, maybe even critical ones for the life of the future life. So what we eat, how physically active we are, and even what microbes we might have in our guts have an influence on our health in the future and on the risk of the disease. So the research in food and nutrition in relation to health will be the overarching theme of the Functional Foods Forum also in the future. And I look forward to learning what new opportunities FFF might bring about. For example, Flavoria, the multidisciplinary research platform. There certainly are a multitude of possibilities for producing new scientific knowledge and consumer understanding. One example being research to advance health promotion by nudging. The current lines of sensory and consumer research related to taste or functionality of food products, as well as human behavior and technology development will fall under the overarching theme of FFF. Similarly, we also need innovation and active dialogue with different stakeholders and industry. Our vision is to be at the front line of the scientific impact research. FFF has taken and will take in the future a strong role also as a societal influencer and as a mediator in taking research into practice. And for these to actualize, we need strong collaboration within faculty, within university, as well as outside the university with other academic actors, together with societal players and industry. Considering clinical nutrition research, collaboration with Turku University Hospital is, of course, of utmost importance. I consider foresight an important asset in achieving the vision. And indeed, we need to closely examine the current trends and anticipate future developments. And this will allow innovation in research as well as provision of food and nutrition solutions that are both healthy and acceptable by the consumers. And further to promote the sustainability and well-being in individual groups of people and maybe even the planet. And lastly, the education and teaching, the vital tasks of the university, they will be even stronger parts of the FFF in the future. And this will actualize as teaching in the curriculum courses of the medical faculty, provision of academic dissertations from bachelor to the doctoral level, as well as development of continuous learning. So I'm truly looking forward to collaborating with the existing staff of the FFF and the networks and creating new collaborations as well. And here I want to congratulate Seppo for your really notable academic contribution thus far. I know your career will continue, maybe in a hopefully a little bit relaxed way. And I wish you all the best for the future and for everyone for listening to me for these few minutes. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I think this was a perfect closing opening of one era of FFF and starting a new one. And now, once again, I'm sorry about this slight delay, but we really want to thank all our speakers and participants, both here in Turku and there in remotely present. You truly built the spirit of the event, and I of course also want to thank our sponsors and long-time collaborators who made it possible to arrange this anniversary event at this level. And now here in Turku we will move on to the cocktail event to continue discussions and enjoy being together, and we also hope to see soon again with all you who participated and joined us remotely today. Wish you all a very nice springtime and hope to see you soon again. Thank you very much. Thank you.